The newest cause celeb of the left. How will mainstream Democrats respond? The call to defund the police. You heard that right. We'll talk about it today on Jay Sekulow Live.
Live from Washington, D.C., Jay Sekulow Live. Phone lines are open for your questions right now. Call 1-800-684-3110. That's 1-800-684-3110. And now, your host, Jordan Sekulow.
Yeah, newsflash, liberals across the country. We do not live in a utopia. Because we do not live in a utopia, we require law enforcement, security, protection to keep us safe, to keep our children safe. That doesn't mean that at all times we're always safe and that there's enough law enforcement to keep everybody safe from every incident or every bad actor or every criminal act. And it also doesn't mean that you give law enforcement a pass when there has been a police abuse. And when you have seen in the George Floyd case most recently, you don't give law enforcement a pass. The question is, what is the correct response? And the radical groups that have been running the protests, which then led to riots, which have now kind of calmed down back into protest, they are now pushing something that I kind of feel like we've dealt with a lot before at the ACLJ when it comes to Israel. Let's just divest from the police. Let's defund the police. We don't need police. Now, let me ask you this. Give us a call, 1-800-684-3110. You want police in your neighborhood? You want police in your city? In your town? How would you feel like if Joe Biden started endorsing a message like this? And we're starting to see how elected Democrats, Dad, are trying to dance around this move, which is moving forward in places like Minneapolis.
Yep.
And they're starting the process there. Los Angeles pulling $150 million out of the police budget. That's not going to add to more training on appropriate police action. It's going to take away from appropriate training methods. But we're starting to see these Democrats say, well it needs to look piece by piece, city by city. They're worried. They're scared, too, that if this becomes the defining message of 2020, instead of George Floyd and police brutality and something we need to deal with as a nation, that defunding the police is a very dangerous, first of all, it's very dangerous, and second, it is a losing, absolutely losing political kind of ideology.
No, I don't think there's any question about that, but just let me read to you what the council president of Minneapolis said. We're committed to dismantling the police as we know it in the city of Minneapolis and to rebuild with our community a new model of public safety that actually keep our community safe. They go on to say, when pressed for details about it, she said they really haven't worked through that yet, but they're going to start with funding. Obviously, they want to cut funding and more to a community-based strategy. Now, look, what happened with these police officers involved in this murder, and that's what I call it, is a crime. It should be prosecuted. It should be rooted out and gotten out of the police departments throughout the country. We should be in a situation where no citizen, and it is especially true within the African-American community, should be subjected and treated like these police officers treated. I mean, it's not just what happened in Minneapolis. It's been many other states. We've seen it over the history. That has to go. But the answer cannot be, it's so simplistic. Oh, we'll just dismantle the police department and then I was reading all these articles last night, and then we'll come up with something that may work. What's that something? Well, they really don't know. Well, maybe you should have the idea of what that's going to be before you start dismantling public safety, because the primary job of local government is community safety and well-being. And I think they're making a serious mistake, a really serious mistake, Jordan, when they take this as the route. They were making a lot of statements and getting a lot of attention to that police brutality, which was good to get the attention. Then it was trying to be hijacked by a few. And then the real protesters took it back from the hijackers. Good. But now the move is to the political move, and in my view, a tremendous mistake.
Folks, let me tell you something. We want to take your calls on this. What are your thoughts on this idea to defund the police? What if you live in Minneapolis or Los Angeles, and they're starting down that path of defunding your police departments? 1-800-684-3110. That's 1-800-684-3110. All right, I want to get everybody's thoughts on this. I mean, this is not a joke, folks. This is happening across the country as we speak. And so in LA, it's $150 million being taken out of the police department's budget. Same, very similar in New York, in the NYPD there, with significant amount of funding being taken out of their budget at a time when you think, with this brutality that we're dealing with, the horrendousness of what happened with George Floyd, the murder there, that police need a lot more training. And they need to go back through their old training books, like Minnesota had to do, and say, hey, let's get rid of the chokehold. You know, that was still on the books. The chokehold was still part of police tactics in Minneapolis until last week. So maybe we need to use those resources to go back through the training materials, retrain, especially those officers who are most commonly find themselves in conflict, street cops, if you will, and spend money that way. Instead, what do they want to do? Pay police officers less and provide them less training? Or, in some cases, just abolish them altogether, like in Minneapolis. We're taking your phone calls, 1-800-684-3110, but I want to go around and get everybody's reaction to this. First, Harry Hutchinson is joining us. Harry, your thoughts on this now growing movement, this cause celeb, which is gaining steam at the municipal level of government in states across the country to defund the police.
Jordan, the move to defund the police, which is growing, is also hugely paradoxical. This is so because defunding the police will leave our most vulnerable populations at risk. Consider a few facts. First, in 2018, there were 7,407 African American homicide victims. Thus understood, Black victims of police shootings represent 0.1% of all African Americans killed in 2019. By contrast, a police officer is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by an African American male than an unarmed Black male. So if you pull back the police, guess what? You leave the most vulnerable populations at risk. The most vulnerable populations largely consist of members of minority groups. We have already seen this in Chicago, Baltimore, and elsewhere, and it has resulted in the added deaths of over 1,000 African Americans as the police pull back. So we have a natural experiment already ongoing. And so if Minneapolis goes down this road, we should see housing prices fall, we should see murder rates go up, and we should see criminals move to Minneapolis because the rate of return on their investment in crime will likely rise.
I mean, who on earth would want to live in a neighborhood and would choose to live in a neighborhood that, by the way, we have no police here? We'll have this community program and I guess neighborhood watch, rely all on that. Nobody who could make that choice would do that. The problem is that a lot of the people who live in these communities don't have that choice to make economically. They're stuck there right now. And so they're going to be stuck being this experiment in outrageously extreme leftist, anti-police, we can live in a utopia. I mean, come on. Let's just read the room, see the world right now. The world is protesting. There's police brutality. We have COVID-19, and yet now we want to abolish police in the worst neighborhoods in the country, by the way, in the toughest places. I mean, this is, to me, this is how Joe Biden ends up losing in 2020 before he even gets started.
We have the ability, because of the depth of our team, to give you some real experience on this. And I want to go to Andy Economo, who is a senior counsel, of course, at the ACLJ, a former United States attorney, also served as a state's attorney general in the state's attorney general's office, and as a assistant district attorney. So he's had the experience across the board dealing with law enforcement and has had the unique experience of both defending police, but also indicting them. So Andy comes to this with a complete package of understanding. So let me start with the first question, Andy, which is, and what happened in Minneapolis was outrageous. It's a crime. It's murder. I think they're having it as second degree. I don't know the intricacies of the law there. I would have thought it would have been murder one, but maybe they didn't think there was enough premeditation. Putting that aside, you've dealt with these situations. Let's talk about how you deal with a situation where police officers violate the law while they're on duty doing an arrest.
Well, the way you do that is you prosecute them. That's how you do it. And I have seen that, and I have done that in point of fact in communities in South Georgia and in North Georgia when we have prosecuted police officers who use excessive force and brutality in effecting arrests and enforcing the law. But the answer is training and instruction to these police officers. And as Jordan pointed out, the chokehold still on the books in Minneapolis Police Department. What an absurd thing that has been removed from most law enforcement agencies. But the answer is not to take the police force and to disband it and glue together a vigilante force subsequent to that to protect them. And I think Professor Hutchison's remarks are really telling. The most vulnerable are the minority and black communities, the poor Hispanic communities among us where there is rampant crime. Who are you going to call when your house is being burglarized? Who are you going to call when you're being assaulted with a weapon? Who are you going to call when your house and your children are being sexually molested and hurt? Are you going to call a protester and to come and to save you? No, you call the police departments because these are the least of these who need the protection more than those in the other communities where there is no crime. I have seen it from both sides, defending police and prosecuting police who have been overly exuberant in their enforcement of the law, Jay. And the answer is not to defund police departments because that calls the fringes of the left and the radical slogans out more and more and more and doesn't do anything to protect the country.
I mean, in a city that can barely get itself off the ground, New York City, hard to say that even, but in a city that is supposed to be reopening today, though the streets look pretty darn empty when you see places that are usually packed like Times Square. This was Mayor Bill de Blasio's message to the public. Take a listen.
I want to make a statement of principle right now that we will be moving funding from the NYPD to youth initiatives and social services.
Again, at a time when the NYPD data is under probably the greatest rate it's been in since 9/11, and they're dealing with still, even though the riots have calmed down, just a city which can't even get itself back off the ground yet, boarded up, burned down, and that's just what we've seen in the news. Office buildings that are empty and trying to reopen, and yet he's trying to reopen this massive city, and the first step he's going to take is take some money away from the police.
Yeah, I mean, you think about this for a moment. I mean, it's not only does not make sense, which of course it does not make sense, but what does it do to the populace? And that's why I want to talk to Harry about this because he lived in Detroit, in the Detroit area. He knows the situation there. And what I'm trying to figure out, and this is what it's perplexing me, they've obviously decided to make a political shift. You went from peaceful protests to then some rebel rousers came in trying to disrupt those peaceful protests. Fortunately, the peaceful protesters basically themselves, with the police, of course, stopped that because it was stealing the moment. Then they went back to peaceful protests, which, as everybody knows, I've defended before the Supreme Court of the United States for 3-4 decades now. So I've defended civil disobedience. I've defended free speech. I don't defend people that take, Molotov cocktails through windows of stores. That's called a crime. Civil disobedience is a crime too, but it's a different level of issue. But here's what I wanted to go with, Harry. Let's talk about this from a policy perspective. You want to have police reform because there's obviously a real problem. But why do you start with the money and defunding the police instead of figuring out how to make it a better situation?
Well, I think the answer, Jay, is because of pure politics. I think some individuals have engaged in a political calculus that the way to power is to claim support for a particular narrative. And that narrative, at least in part, is the claim that there is systematic or systemic police racism. On the other hand, other observers see little evidence of bias, or at least bias that justifies substantive reform that could include changing America's approach to policing that has left more than 1,000 Americans fatally shot by law enforcement. So we need first to look at the facts, and second, we need to emphasize the vulnerable populations who will be at risk without police.
All right, folks, we come back. A lot of phone calls to take, a lot of comments to take. 1-800-684-3110. That's 1-800-684-3110. As always, stay up to date with all that we're doing at ACLJ.org. Here's what Harvard psychologist Stephen Pinker wrote in his book, The Blank Slate. This comes from page 331 for Dick Durbin out there. This is so you can find the actual page citation. I see Than laughing about that. He understands that joke there. He said this, though. When law enforcement vanishes, again, Harvard psychologist, when law enforcement vanishes, all manner of violence breaks out. Looting, seen that. Settling old scores like vigilante justice. Ethnic cleansing. That's some of the worst of when law enforcement vanishes. Petty warfare among gangs, warlords, and mafias. This was obvious in the remnants of Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, and parts of Africa in the 1990s, but can also happen in countries with a long tradition of civility. He gives an example that when he was a young teenager in peaceful Canada during the 1960s, he believed in anarchism. And he laughed at his parents' arguments that if government ever laid down its arms, all sorts of things would break loose. Well, their competing predictions got put to the test. At 8 a.m. on October 17th, 1969, the Montreal Police Department went on strike. By 11:20 a.m., the first bank was robbed. By noon, most downtown stores had closed up because of looting. Within a few more hours, taxi drivers burned down the garage of a limousine service that had competed with them for airport customers. A rooftop sniper killed a provincial police officer. Rioters broke into several hotels and restaurants, and a doctor slew a burglar in his suburban home. By the end of the day, this is just there, 6 banks had been robbed, 100 shops had been looted, 12 fires had been set, 40 carloads of storefront glass had been broken, and $3 million in property damage had been inflicted before city authorities had to call in the army, of course, the Mounties, to restore order. This decisive empirical test left my politics in tatters and offered a foretaste of life as a scientist. You realize this was the 1960s, and what happened in his community when the police just went on strike for one day. Yeah. That, Dad, to me, is very telling, and why it's so concerning to say, hey, in Minneapolis, we don't need police. We'll come up with something else.
Yeah, so, look, I completely agree with the sentiment of the political scientists there, but I think there's a deeper problem. What we're finding, and I think what we're seeing, is actually knee-jerk reactions to a horrible situation. And you never want to make a major decision in the middle of a really difficult situation because you're not weighing out all the alternatives. Now, first, let me go to Than, and then I got a question for Harry and Andy. But Than, from a Washington, D.C. perspective right now, it's interesting. In the District of Columbia, the mayor there is demanding that the federal government remove its National Guard forces. Of course, she doesn't have the authority to do that, but she's exercising an authority she doesn't have. How is all that playing in Washington right now?
Well, first of all, just optically, Jay, I think it's interesting that these federal officials who are calling for the abolition of police, not a single one has been willing to dismantle their own personal security detail. I think that tells you quite a lot. But look, I start on this, Jay, where Jordan started. There is always a political opportunity cost to consider. And there is currently, Jay, there is an unprecedented amount of consensus on the need for underlying reform on this issue. That is a political opportunity for progress. The vast majority of Americans will acknowledge the pain of our friends and neighbors who are hurting, and they want to help address the source of that pain. But, Jay, in Washington, D.C., the reflex of the political left is always to run to the far left of these catastrophic proposals. I would associate myself with Professor Hutchison's comments about who would be the most impacted. It would be the most vulnerable. It's a tremendous overreaction, and it would make things worse. But, Jay, just as Americans of all political stripes are recognizing the need for reform, every American ought to be able to clearly speak to the fact that this particular policy proposal would actually make the problem worse. And here's the worst thing, Jay. It would also cloud out the consensus that is forming or in Washington, D.C. on the need for reform. That'll go away, Jay, and the reform won't happen if the focus is here.
So I wanted to go to Professor Hutchison on this. So, Harry, I don't think anybody that's looked at this situation objectively could argue that this is not a situation where reform is necessary, because it happens too often. And when you watch that sickening video of that officer putting his neck, to kill the guy. That's what it was. To kill Mr. Floyd. That's what it was. And people standing around, including other officers. Some of those officers were only on the active force for 3 or 4 days. And then now they've been accused of at least accomplices to murder. But I want to talk about the deeper issue, which is, how do we get through the American psyche that there is a need for real reform within police departments? Not every police department. Some police departments get it right. But a general understanding of how we protect our citizens while the police still protect the citizens in their official capacity. In other words, what's the way forward here for the American people and for these local communities?
Jay, you raised a brilliant question. And so where I would start first is with an understanding of the underlying facts. It is clear beyond question that we should hold bad officers accountable, including Derek Chauvin, the officer who essentially killed George Floyd. I agree with that. On the other hand, we should also note that there were only 27 police-involved shootings of unarmed individuals in 2019. This is down from 70 during the second to last year of the Obama administration in 2015. So, yes, there's still a problem. Bad officers must indeed be held accountable, but we should not transform the entire police department in every single major city because we haven't yet held all police officers who are bad accountable. We need to emphasize that. That should be first and foremost in our mind. But we should also note, as Professor Roland Fryer, an African-American economist at Harvard, has noted, that there is evidence of what can go wrong when and if police officers pull back from vulnerable neighborhoods. He has shown that when cops pull back from such areas, homicides increase, meaning that if we truly believe that Black lives matter, then pulling back the police is simply one of the best ways, unfortunately, to increase the homicide toll in vulnerable minority communities. And so he has looked at evidence in Ferguson, he's looked at evidence in Chicago and in Baltimore, and the evidence is crystal clear. Homicides have gone up, other crimes have exploded in these areas, and the people in those areas, most of whom are vulnerable, lack the economic resources to leave. That's a problem.
Folks, we've got a second half hour of Jay Sekulow Live coming up next. If you want to join us, we've got a lot of phone calls, questions, comments we're ready to answer. We'll start doing that right when we come back from this break. Phone lines are full right now, but we continually, one just opened up. So give us a call, 1-800-684-3110. That's 1-800 684-3110. Your thoughts, your comments. What would this look like in your community? And are you in LA? Are you in Minneapolis? And having to deal with this potentially defunding of the police? We'll talk about that when we come back.
Thanks to your support of the ACLJ, we have had many victories.
The IRS now formally apologizing to Tea Party groups.
If any group feels that they're being targeted, they can go to federal court and bring our case. That's a victory.
It's one of the most significant wins in the ACLJ's history, to take on the IRS and win.
For more than 27 years, the ACLJ has been fighting for freedom and liberty in the United States and around the globe.
These are young people in their 20s and 30s that are doing this. They're fighting for life at a whole new level to beat back the abortion juggernaut. But I actually think we're winning this. This is one of the social issues we're winning.
The release of Andrew Brunson.
We're flying and they finally left Turkish airspace. It's like, okay, we're really out of Turkey and free again.
We need your help as we continue this work here in the United States and around the world. Join us online at the American Center for Law and Justice at aclj.org.
Live from Washington, D.C., Jay Sekulow Live. And now, your host, Jordan Sekulow.
Welcome to Jay Sekulow Live. This is Jordan Sekulow. Let me just kind of set the stage for you on what's going on right now in the country. This move to defund the police. It's become a popular rallying cry for celebrities, for politicians, for leftist activists. So on Sunday, just last night, 9 members of the Minneapolis City Council, the city where George Floyd died, pledged to, quote, begin the process of ending, not defunding, but ending the Minneapolis Police Department. The calls for dismantling the city police are perhaps the loudest from City Council member Jeremiah Ellison. He happens to be the son of the Attorney General of Minnesota, Keith Ellison. The younger Ellison has said that after taking apart the police department, we're not simply going to glue it back together. So this isn't just reforming the police department. It's destroying the police department. We are going to dramatically rethink how we approach public safety and emergency response. It's really past due. Important to note, the younger Ellison previously tweeted during the riots, I hereby declare officially my support for Antifa. So that's the guy who's going to be leading the charge to reform what public security looks like in these areas in Minneapolis. On Sunday, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio announced a plan to repurpose money for law enforcement and send them to other avenues. The Los Angeles mayor got a bit more specific. He said he will plan to cut up to $150 million from the LAPD's city police department and redistribute the money to communities of color. How he's going to do that and what he's distributing the money for is not clear. We see the same kind of moves to defund in Chicago, Portland, Washington, D.C., and others. This comes at a time when we've had police officers, a police officer in Las Vegas shot in the head, police in New York and New Jersey injured by bricks and rocks, one stabbed in Los Angeles in the neck. In Los Angeles, one officer suffered a fractured skull, and officers in other cities have suffered injuries in hit-and-run accidents that led from these riots. Now, if defund the police, I want to go to Than on this before we take calls. If Joe Biden gets too close to this or utters this, because you never know what's going to come out of his mouth. I mean, this is even worse than his kind of basket of deplorables comment that 10 to 15% of Americans are just bad, which is 50 million people. That comes from, of course, Mr. Incarceration himself, Joe Biden. But now he's going to say that we want to defund the police. That is where his party is trying to push him.
Yeah, absolutely, Jordan, and it would be catastrophic for him. And look, I would point people to what happened in Minneapolis, the situation you just described, where the mayor of Minneapolis was actually in front of the protesters, the demonstrators, and Jordan, he agrees with them on about 90 to 95% of their policy proposals. He is a very far left elected official, but he would not go so far as saying that he's for abolishing the police. What happened there, Jordan? They jeered and yelled and chased him out of the protest. Look, if you think that is a a recipe for political success at the ballot box, then you've got a different thing coming. If that is where the party polls Joe Biden, Jordan, I can list you a list of states that's as long as my arm, and I'm sure you can too, that he is going to have a very difficult time carrying, because those might sound like good sound bites, but the people in those communities, Jordan, they know what Harry articulated so well. The first call that they make when there's a need is to that police department that will be abolished if these policies are enacted.
Yeah, I don't, Dad, I do not want to live in a community that has no police.
No one does, if in reality. And Jordan, these people that are calling for this, they're making political statements. They are not going to be able to do this. This is not the reality of what is going to happen. What are they going to do? I was a school patrol, remember, with the orange belt? What are they going to do? Put school patrol in charge of this? So the answer is no, of course not. So this is politics. What we want to do is explain to everybody the reality of what's happening here. You should protect and agree with the protesters when they're saying we need reform, because I think everybody agrees we need reform. But to attack the police like this, the entire police department, because of rogue actors, is a big mistake for public security.
Like we read, cities have not survived a single day of a police strike. I mean, the city's burned, folks. The city's burned, the stores are robbed, and we've seen what happens with these riots. There's not enough police. We'll be right back. We're going to start taking those calls and comments.
Thanks to your support of the ACLJ, we have had many victories.
The IRS now formally apologizing to Tea Party groups.
The IRS did the right thing by resolving the case with an injunction that mandated a complete change of the IRS nonprofit tax-exempt work as it relates to issue advocacy organization.
If any group feels like they're being targeted, they can go to federal court and bring our case. That's a victory.
It's one of the most significant wins in the ACLJ's history, to take on the IRS and win.
For more than 27 years, the ACLJ has been fighting for freedom and liberty in the United States and around the globe.
These are young people in their 20s and 30s that are doing this, are fighting for life at a whole new level to beat back the abortion juggernaut. We've got a whole group of young lawyers that are defending them.
Those of us that believe in life know that we're on the right side of history. We understand full well children are children, and they're precious in God's sight, and they're precious in our nation's sight, and they're precious to parents.
But I actually think we're winning. This is one of the social issues we're winning.
The release of Andrew Brunson. He is the American evangelical from North Carolina, held in Turkey for more than 2 years.
They're rushing us to the airport, and there was an Air Force plane that came from Germany that had been on standby. We're flying, and they finally left Turkish airspace. It's like, okay, now we're really out of Turkey and free again.
We're grateful to ACLJ who put it out to these people, they were getting all this out.
All of the people who prayed for us through ACLJ and through your contacts, I'm thankful, I'm grateful, and actually I'm astounded.
We need your help as we continue this work here in the United States and around the world. Join us online at the American Center for Law and Justice at aclj.org.
Let's get to some phone calls. 1-800-684-3110. Jake calling in from Kansas. Online too. Welcome back to Jay Sekulow Live. Jake, you're on the air.
Hey, Jordan. Hey, Jay.
Hey.
So my question is, I'm a law enforcement officer here in Kansas.
Thank you for your service.
Whenever I submit a probable cause affidavit, I have to swear, I'm duly appointed. I am certified. If they disband the Minneapolis Police Department, how do they ever get that done in the courts? How do you ever get a warrant? How do you ever get anything done to the court system?
You asked the course. This is the critical question. So this whole idea about defunding the police department, and this is what Andy was talking about, and getting rid of them makes absolutely no sense. Zero. And I want to say first, Jake, thank you for your service to our country and to your community. Because I look, most police officers, folks, do a really great job. We know that. So let's not paint with this broad brush. But you raise a really good question, a very serious question, and that is, if in fact the police department was disbanded, how do you do a probable cause arrest? What if there's domestic violence? Who comes to the rescue of the person that's the victim of the domestic violence? If there's a juvenile situation where a minor is in harm's way, who are you going to call here? Private security guards? You can't do that. So I think that they're making Jake a political statement without thinking of the real consequences. And Andy, when I think about that, and you talk about what law enforcement actually does, I made the statement, you can't have the school crossing patrol handle these things.
No, you are absolutely right. This is a dangerous, counterproductive, and very irrational move. For example, the caller said he's got to sign warrants for affidavits for search warrants. Who's going to do that anymore? Who is going to come and make a probable cause affidavit before a magistrate that a burglary has been committed, or that an armed robbery has been committed, or that a child is being sexually assaulted by his guardian or his parent, or that a wife is being beaten by her husband? Who's going to handle those things? Are we going to be just a lawless society with guns and ammunition to protecting our house? Do I have to go out and hire my own vigilante force to guard my house because of fear that there is no police to come to my rescue if something happens? That is not, and the sad thing, Jay, is this is no longer a call. When you hear defund the police, you think, oh, this is from the fringes of the far left and no one else. This is no longer just a call from the far left. It has gone from a radical slogan, and this is the fear that I have, to the actual policy of major American cities. Los Angeles, New York, Minneapolis, and others are actually saying, do away with those officers who enforce the law. Do away with the safety net that you go to when you're in deep distress. And as I said before, when you are being beaten up and assaulted, are you going to call a protester to come and help you? Or are you going to say, police, help, police? I know which I'm going to say.
All right, let's go back to the phones, 1-800-684-3110. A lot of folks with a lot of thoughts and comments on this. Lucy in New Jersey on line 4. This hits home to her. Lucy, welcome to Jay Sekulow Live. You're on the air.
Hi. I just have a comment. My husband is a police officer in New Jersey, and I have family members who are police officers in New York. So, de Blasio, I think what he's doing is he's trying to balance his extreme budget on the backs of those wonderful police men and women that serve their city. And B, I'm worried about the police officers themselves, their mental psyche. Like, I know some of them are working 12-hour shifts with no days off. And so instead of funding and helping them cope and training and all of those things, they're actually going to take all that away. And then one more thing, the terrorists, they're watching all this. We're talking about major cities that we're leaving wide open for them to come and to destroy our country, and to cause us harm. So we're gonna just take away all the policemen, and who's gonna defend us?
You've raised a really interesting point, Lucy, and Jordan, as you know, and I'm going to go to Jordan and Harry on this, and maybe even have Dan touch on it. So police departments in major cities have counterterrorism units. And Minneapolis, I'm sure, has a counterterrorism unit. They do. The idea that you would close down these departments, Jordan, and what are you putting in its place, and what are you going to do with the counterterrorism units, which are really, in coordination with the federal government, kind of the first line of defense on terrorism?
Yeah, this is
international and domestic.
This is why it is so much more complicated than even the Minneapolis City Council is moving forward like this, and they're not considering any of it. Counterterrorism units, SWAT teams, helicopters forces. Specialized police forces. What about schools, Dad? We're not going to have any police officers at schools? That's pretty scary.
So like where most kids go to school now, my grandkids included, there are police. And I think I look at that as a real positive. Yeah. Harry, you raised the issue earlier that the real harm here is going to be to these communities. It's unfortunate. It's the communities that have had the police brutality, so to speak, the police abuse. But when you defund the police or dismantle a police department, it really impacts that community directly.
Absolutely. And certainly I have lived through that. I was in Detroit during the riots in the 60s Entire swaths of the city were decimated. People moved out if they could, and it left the most vulnerable at even more risk of robberies, homicide, and the like. And so what we're talking about, when we defund the police, we're essentially agreeing to more crime, more violence, more homicides, particularly for members of minority communities. Second, it means, just in terms of economic terms, housing values in many areas should fall, as criminals now have an incentive to ramp up their criminal activity with impunity, and this exposes vulnerable populations to even more risk. And third, it means that criminals who are wishing to increase their return on investment from an economic terms, they will consider relocating to Minneapolis or these other cities. And we should also note that this move to defund is pushed by celebrities, including John Legend and Jane Fonda. And the question really becomes, are they willing to give up their private security personnel? Are they willing to move out of Beverly Hills, California, or some other wealthy area into the inner cities of Los Angeles and expose their own lives to risk? And I think the answer is no. So this has become highly politicized. And lastly, I would suggest that what individuals in Minneapolis and other places are likely to do is to put their house up for sale and move if they can. But again, as I said earlier, that simply means that the most vulnerable among us, they will be exposed to higher crime rates, higher homicide rates, and that would be the bottom line.
All right, let's go back. Try and take another call before this break. 1-800-684-3110. Kay in New Hampshire on line 5. Kay, welcome to Jay Sekulow Live. You're on the air.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you taking my call. I'm going to talk quickly so I can get to the point that I wanted to make. I'm the wife of a federal officer and a sister-in-law of a retired assistant chief of police for a large city. Neither my husband nor my brother-in-law ever engaged in any kind of abuse of authority and would never stand by and allow another fellow officer to take the life of another human being, even if they were a suspect or not. That being said, myself being the wife and sister-in-law of two officers at the state and federal level, I have had to endure and am still enduring, along with my husbands and kids, the wrath of the retaliation for my reporting stalking of our residents by the friends of a creepy male who had a bloody heart on his Facebook page who was telling females to take their clothes off. Unfortunately, the girl that was driving this car, her dad was a fireman and friends with the local PD. Since that day, we have been detained. I have been detained for walking against traffic. I've had an officer with his hand on his gun.
So you think you're getting retribution or retaliation? So there's Andy, really quickly, there's laws on retaliation.
Yes, there definitely is. We don't allow this retaliation for people who cooperate and assist the police, and you should go to your district attorney or to your local law enforcement, if it exists in your community anymore and hasn't been abolished, and tell them that there is retaliation against you for the fact that you are associated and affiliated with law enforcement. We don't allow that. We don't stand for that.
No, we don't. We certainly cannot in the United States of America. We're not too good to point out when we have done wrong, when we have had flaws. We've done that throughout our history. We've been in a self-correcting process throughout the founding of our country. And the George Floyd matter is no different. But the way to correct it is not to just abolish everything and then have no police and no extra training for those officers. Always stay up to speed at aclj.org. We got a lot of calls to take when we come back and comments when we come back from this break. Keep calling us, though. Phone lines will open up. 1-800-684-3110. We'll be right back on Jay Sekulow Live. You would laugh if it wasn't so scary. I was just reading through about, here's some of the ideas they have to abolish the police in some areas like New York. So no more traffic stops. Which, there's various reasons to do that. For instance, if it's a stolen vehicle, suspected drugs, suspected speeding. Okay, so just using these terms. Street outreach teams replacing police. So vigilante justice. People who get to make up their mind about who is bad and who is not. And if you believe Joe Biden, that's very scary because 50 million Americans are very bad people. So, I don't know if I want that to be done. It goes even further, though. Sex workers unionized. Get this one, Dad. I would love to get Dad, Harry, and Andy's comment on this.
Take some calls, though, too.
Burglaries resolved by restorative justice.
Yeah, I'll tell you what that means. Don't prosecute. Say, would you give us the documents back? Would you give us the jewelry that you stole back? Would you give us the money you took from us back, please? Because that way we can avoid the court costs. I mean, let's go quickly on this because I want to get to calls. Andy, your reaction to restorative justice?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. When you have a bank robber and he comes in and he pulls a gun and he robs the bank of $50,000, we don't prosecute him. We don't have a police officer there. We don't try to take him into custody. We say, I'll tell you what. We will forget all about the bank robbery, the danger that you put the tellers in, the danger that you put the bank personnel in. Just give the money back and we'll let you go to the next bank. That's how ridiculous a system like that would be. I had a bank robber once, and he actually, through his lawyer, said, "If we give the money back, will you forget it?" And I said, "Are you crazy?"
Harry?
Well, I think Andy is absolutely correct. All this proposal would do in terms of defunding the police and let's call it the restorative justice, basically all we are doing is we are incentivizing more crime, particularly, as I said earlier, in vulnerable areas. And so if you live in Beverly Hills, if you live in the northwest part of Washington, D.C., and you're surrounded by security teams like former President Obama, this is absolutely wonderful as a thought experiment. But the reality is quite different.
Yep. Jordan, let's go ahead and take Jamie's call. He's been holding for a long time.
Hey, Jamie in Oklahoma, line 1. Jamie, thanks for holding. You're on the air.
Hi, guys. Appreciate all you do.
Thank you.
I have a kind of a double whammy here. I had an experience with a police officer. My son had been transferred back to Oklahoma with his company, and he had been working extremely long hours. And so he was using my vehicle. And I got a call at like 1 a.m, and it was him, and he was not very far away, and he had dozed and hit a tree. You know, he wasn't going fast because he was still alive, but he was barely hurt. So I go down there and I start talking to the policeman, and this policeman literally jumped on me, telling me to shut up. That if I didn't shut up, that he was going to put me in cuffs and take me to jail. So I turned around and I said, I'd like to speak with your supervisor. And he was nose to nose with me. And the other police officers told him, he said, man, back off.
I've had not that experience, but I've had, there's been some odd ones, I would say. I'm going to go to Andy on this, but I've had some odd ones, like being stopped once in Virginia Beach for I'm not kidding you, folks, going 26 miles an hour in a 15-mile-an-hour zone. Now, I don't even know how you drive a car 15 miles an hour, but okay. And you would have thought this was right after 9/11. I wanted to say, I would never say it would be disrespectful. Instead of stopping me, how about catching the terrorists? Wouldn't that be a little bit better use of funds? But I'm never disrespectful back to the officer. If the officer says, the problem is what these officers have done in these black communities, now again, not all of them, not most of them, but enough that it's causing a problem, is the belligerence from the officer. They have to you could be very respectful, even in a situation that's highly charged. And that's where the training of these police officers and consequences if they violate it, Andy, have to come in. And you've taken those cases.
Yes, that's exactly right. Consequences and training. Look, I'm not for defunding the police. I am for quadrupling the budgets of the police and using that money to train them in situations such as the one that the caller mentioned. You don't get in somebody's face. You're always polite and courteous. And the other officers she mentioned said, hey, back off, and that is the correct reaction. But it's training, teaching people how to react in situations that are potentially volatile. And that's what we need to do, not abolish and do away with the police and have private security forces at each person's house, but train them how to react to volatile situations and teach them how to react instead of putting a knee on somebody's neck, and when they're gasping for breath and saying, let me go, you ought to let them go. But those are the kinds of things. There's going to be bad apples in any organization, Jay. I've seen this in police departments throughout the state where I practice law. But that is the minority. It really is. It is not the majority of people in law enforcement.
Jordan, let's take Jason's call.
Yeah, Jason, Oregon, on line 3. Jason, thanks for holding on. You're on the air. Hey,
so did they even consider what would happen when 911 calls and the EMTs and the paramedics need that police covering on a hot spot or a heated situation? They're going to send them in vulnerable. I mean, what do they think when something like that's going to happen?
Well, I mean, I think this is the biggest concern. If you actually enacted something like Minneapolis is doing, what about all those services that also we pay for with our taxpayer dollars to use in emergency services, whether it's the ambulances, EMS, fire departments? Dad, they rely on police. Yep. Everyone knows that. Who's first there? It's the fire trucks with the police. It's the police with the ambulance. They are there to protect those who are performing those emergency duties, but also in case things get out of control.
Exactly right. I wanted to go to Harry on this because I want to close with this. And that's the impact that this, Harry, I always want to look at the empirical data. What's the evidence going to show? Where does this go? What is the impact on a move like this in Minneapolis? What is the impact of that on the communities there?
Well, I think the impact is likely to be more fragmentation, more separation, perhaps even less support for law and order. And most poignantly, we are likely to see, sadly, a rise in domestic violence. And so if you look at the data, you will find, for instance, that when there is a shooting involving police officers or citizens, often it comes out of domestic violence situations. So, for instance, you have a spouse who's engaged in domestic violence. Who do they call in Minneapolis? Who's there to protect the individual that's vulnerable, which sometimes includes children? And so I think one of the sad things about Minneapolis and some of these other efforts is there is no thinking involved. And the other thing that cities could do, other than defund the police, and they probably should actually increase funding, is they should consider or reconsider their agreements with police officer unions.
All right, folks, we'll be